or the lack thereof could impact the dollars you keep in your wallet. In February, Governor Evers proposed a $3.15 billion increase for K-12 schools in his budget, which was short of the $4 billion ask from State Superintendent of Public Schools Jill Underly. The Republican-led legislature has rejected those numbers, and it's going to be a few months before we know what the final number is going to be. Already this year, Wisconsin school districts have put 94 referenda on ballots to help pay for either facilities or operating costs. 53 of those were approved by voters, including one in Oshkosh for nearly $200 million. Since 2019, when we've had a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, there have been 491 referenda on ballots, 362 of which passed. That's 74%. But if they don't pass, are they done for good? New research from the impartial Wisconsin Policy Forum says no. And we welcome in Ari Brown. He is a senior research associate at the Wisconsin Policy Forum. So Ari, before we get into these retries, these second attempts by districts, let's just talk about the sheer number of operating referenda that we've seen, right? There was a record number, 148 in 2024, and a couple in this year. We're over 200 since the start of 2024. What does that indicate to you?
Yeah, so we have seen a record number of referenda over the last couple of years, the most ever in a single year last year at 241 held. There were also a record number approved. This year we saw 94 total, which is the most in a non-midterm or presidential election year since 2007, so a very long time. I think what this tells us, and especially given that most of these that we've seen are operating referenda, districts asking their voters to approve additional dollars for just regular operations, I think what we're seeing is, districts really starting to feel the effects of certainly the last couple of years of inflation, but additionally, a statewide funding formula that for a long time has not necessarily kept pace with inflation. So not just the effects of the last couple of years, but really we go as far back as 2011, 2012, when things got kind of decoupled from inflation. Districts have really felt that over time. I think that's also, could be a reaction to some of the things that we saw during the pandemic. There are certainly capital needs. We have not seen, districts move away from doing capital referenda, but certainly a lot of the inflationary pressures and just general budgetary pressures over the last couple of years, we think are really playing a role in the number of referenda we've seen on ballots.
All right, and your research this time around really targeted how many districts, after having been rejected one time at the voter booth, come back a second time. Are they having success at a second bite at the apple?
So when we looked at this question, this was something we've been interested in digging into for a while. We found that not only do most districts, both for operating and capital purposes, when a referendum has failed, not only do districts go back to their voters and ask a similar question a majority of the time within 2 years of that failure, but in most cases, eventually a referendum is approved. It might not necessarily be on the first try. The district may need to go back a third or a fourth or even a fifth time to ask again. But in a majority of cases, eventually that district is successful. I think what we've really seen over the last couple of years, though, the big shift is that districts have been more and more willing to go back to referendum specifically for operating purposes. And I think we've really heard stories, particularly of districts that, when it comes to operations, are really on the brink of reaching a budgetary crisis. I think the story that we talk about in this specific piece that we published was the Mauston School District that went back to voters retried once and failed that retry, went back a second time and said, if we do not pass this operating referendum, we are going to need to eventually dissolve as a district. They were able to pass that referendum by a pretty wide margin on that second retry, but there are cases like this all across the state, and I think that this is potentially a reason why we've seen districts, particularly for operating referendum, be more willing to go back to voters, is that for many of them, it really is a matter of life or death.
And if it's not that, Ari, how does a 2018 law impact districts wanting to go back a second time and try and get that passed early? What does that mean in terms of funding?
Yeah, so there was this law passed a couple of years ago that essentially penalizes districts for failing to pass an operating referendum. If a district goes to, the basics of this are, if a district goes to operating referendum and fails, if they are at something called the low revenue ceiling, the state formula, restricting them to a certain amount of revenue that they can garner per pupil generally from property taxes and from general state aid, as well as a few other sources. If they fail an operating referendum and they're at that limit, they are frozen at that limit for a couple of years, I believe 3 years. But if they succeed in an operating referendum, they are now back to whatever their low revenue would, or their revenue limit would be regardless of that first failure. So districts are certainly incentivized to go back to referendum if, in the case of the failure of an operating referendum for that reason.
So I'm curious, with all this research that you've done, is there anything in there that indicates, because we're talking about a lot of referenda going to the voters often, often is what this looks like. Is there anything that tells you that there could be fatigue among voters with this, even though the success rates are seemingly better than 50%?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of signs. I think one of them is that even though a majority of referenda are approved, we have generally seen approval rates decline over the last couple of years.
Okay.
We mentioned that approval rates in 2025 were around 56%. It's a slight increase over what they were in 2023, which would be the most recent non-midterm or presidential election year. But in general, approval rates in 2025 are lower than they've been over the last decade or so. We have seen a decline from kind of a peak in 2018 or 2019. The other sign that we really have here is the Marquette Law Poll asks this question that essentially amounts to going to their survey folks and saying, would you rather decrease your property taxes or increase funding for public schools, essentially weighing that as an option. And in the case of referenda, that really is the question that's being asked. Over time, certainly since that peak in 2018 or 2019, we have seen the proportion of voters who would rather decrease their property taxes increase quite a bit. We have seen the percentage that would rather increase funding for public schools decline. That's actually at a low point since the Marquette Law Poll started asking this question back in 2013. So those are certainly signs that, voters are really, I think, cognizant that referenda are on the ballot more and more often, and that their personal finances might be, a little bit tighter than they used to be.
All right, Ari, thanks so much for diving into this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.